tuning in to this episode of The Dancing Professor. On this episode, I really wanted to focus a bit more on quantitative research methodology as opposed to qualitative research. We spent a lot of time talking about qualitative research methodologies, including things like usability testing, heuristic evaluations, cognitive interviews, but one method that I find is very popular even as a qualitative researcher is a survey. So survey research is considered quantitative as opposed to qualitative, but it is still a very popular form of methodology and very popular type of research that we use a lot. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to cover in this particular lecture. So we'll talk about quantitative methods and the difference between those and qualitative. We'll talk about specific goals that the UX survey has and the specific questions that surveys are able to answer. We'll talk about why we use them, right? So what is the purpose of a survey? And then, because some of us actually have to construct our own surveys, I kind of wanted to go through some do's and don'ts and best practices that go into constructing a good survey. After we talk about that, we'll talk about how we can actually analyze surveys, and also more importantly, how you actually can distribute surveys. How does the sampling work? How do you find participants? So on and so forth. So if we talk about the difference between quantitative and qualitative research, we know that quantitative research typically involves numbers. Qualitative research typically involves more verbal responses, more words. When we do qualitative research, such as things like usability testing, cognitive walkthroughs, etc., we're really trying to understand user behavior. So if you remember, in our previous lecture when we talked about usability testing, we know that 5 to 7 participants is a decent amount for participants for a usability test. With 5 to 7 participants, we're able to uncover at least 80% of the problems with a particular product. When we do quantitative research, we're more concerned with discovering facts. We want to understand what the facts are versus why people are behaving a certain way. If we talk about the data analysis, right, or the format in which we collect the data, qualitative research is typically going to be structured around patterns that we've identified by interviewing these 5 to 7 people, and they're typically in the form of words or quotes. Sometimes we can code certain quotes that we hear frequently, but for the most part, the data is structured as words and verbal data. If we talk about data analysis for quantitative methods, well, that typically involves numbers and some sort of numerical comparison. Also, if you're talking about testing for statistical significance, we will typically have to use survey quantitative data as opposed to qualitative. So what kind of insight do these two methods really provide for us as researchers? Well, if we're talking about qualitative data, we can understand that the certain factors that determine the behavior of a particular group by asking questions about why they feel a certain way, why they performed a particular function. When you administer a survey, the researcher is typically not present to ask all of the why questions, and so the general idea and the general insight that we have is how much of a certain behavior is present in a group. So we have this how much question versus why is that behavior happening. And then when you're actually reporting your results for these two different methods, for qualitative methods, you're typically talking about in the language of the users, right? What did the users say? What are some memorable quotes, or what are some things that actually stood out to you as the researcher? When you're doing quantitative research, you're mainly depending more on statistical significance, inferences, numerical comparisons, averages, things like that. And so an example of a quantitative method would be something like looking at analytics for a particular website. And of course, usability testing is a common one that we talk about in qualitative testing. The Nielsen and Norman group kind of put together this chart here that we're seeing on the right side of the screen. So qualitative research is typically used to answer the why questions, right? Why did the users do this? Why did the users have trouble doing this? Why did the users spend so much time doing this particular task? For quantitative research, again, our question is how many and how much. How many people struggled with this? on a scale of 1 to 5, how much of a problem did this cause, so on and so forth. And again, going back to the goals of the two different types, the goals of qualitative research are both formative and summative. So they are used to inform design decisions, right? And they can also help us identify usability issues and find solutions for them. So we know that because we've talked about multiple methods of qualitative research. If we talk about the quantitative research, those are generally giving us a summary of the current data set that we have. And so we use that to evaluate the usability of something that currently exists. We can track usability of a certain product over time. We can compare product X with its competitor factors, and we can compare rate of interest. So all of these different things, because we have logs data and we have methodology and software that tracks where people click, how much time they spent watching a certain video, how much time or how many clicks they clicked on a particular ad on a website, all of that thing that can tell us how much, and those quantitative numeric feedback, that's definitely where the quantitative research comes in. So when do we use qual and when do we use quant? Well, generally, qualitative research can be conducted anytime, before the design, during redesign, or even when you have like the final version of the product that you want to test and make sure that everything's going smoothly. For quantitative research, you typically use that when you have some sort of a working product, and that's typically at the beginning of a cycle or at the end of a design cycle. Generally, if you want to compare the baseline of before to the final product of after the iterations have been conducted, so that you can compare the before to the after, going back to those same factors that we mentioned, clicks, duration, basically so you have a comparison of the final product and the product you started with. As far as the outcome goes for qualitative research, the findings are generally based on the researcher's impressions, interpretations, and prior knowledge of whatever happened in the qualitative research session. So, for example, it's up to the researcher to interpret the phrasing of the participants. It's up to the researcher to identify those patterns that they noticed in the usability study. For quantitative research, it's a bit more objective, because generally you don't, you're just analyzing the numbers, and there's only kind of one correct answer. There's only one way to interpret if you have statistical significance or not. So the results in a quantitative study are definitely statistically meaningful, and in order to determine if they're valid, they're likely to have been replicated in another study. So as far as the outcome, it really depends on the question that the stakeholder has. Because if you think about it, right, why don't we always then conduct quantitative research if it's that much more objective, if it can prove statistical significance? So of course there are a lot of different factors that go into whether you want to conduct a survey or not, or even if you can, and we'll talk about those as we go further through this discussion. If we talk about how the methodologies differ, if we think about qualitative research, we know, again, that qualitative research typically involves about 5 to 7 participants. The study conditions tend to be flexible and are usually adjusted to your particular team's or stakeholders' needs. A think aloud protocol is definitely a very common type of qualitative method. Conversely, if we think about quantitative research, in order to obtain statistical significance, in order to obtain statistical power, rather, you definitely need to have a much larger N, a much larger sample size. So quant research typically involves many more participants, and you have very, very well-defined, strict study conditions. There's typically no think aloud protocol involved in this, because oftentimes for a survey, the researcher is not even present to ask the participants these questions. Now, that's not always the case, but for the most part, whenever a survey is distributed, typically the researcher is not there. So now that we've kind of covered this general difference between quantitative research and qualitative research, let's take a look at the best and most appropriate times for when we use a survey. So generally, if we want to gather small amounts of information from a large amount of people, the survey is the way to go. This is completely opposite from a usability study where we gather large amounts of data from small groups of people. Additionally, another word for describing quantitative research, you might hear the phrase at scale. So when you're doing research at scale or collecting data at scale, that means that you have employed some sort of quantitative method, such as a survey. Surveys are typically used in addition to a lab study or another UX method. This is a little bit different if we compare human factor psychology versus like general experimental psychology. Yes, the experiment part is the thing that we do in the lab, for example, or the particular research method we apply. But as far as controlling variables and confounds and all of those things that we're very, very careful of when we do experimental psychology, those are a little bit more relaxed when it comes to human factor psychology. For example, you typically don't want to test a product on an absolutely random group of people. You typically want to choose a target audience, people who you know will use the product, and then test it on them. So this is very different from using random sampling like we typically do in experimental psychology. So also in experimental psychology, it's not very common that we will do more than one experiment or that we will do more than one methodology within that experiment. For UX research and for human factor psychology, that's very common. And so typically a quant study will be combined with a qualitative study. So a survey can definitely be used in addition to a lab study. Typically, a survey is administered after you conducted a lab study so that you're able to answer the what questions, but not the why. So designers and product teams may need information on user needs prior to designing a product, for example. So a survey can gauge the majority preference or the majority opinion of a group of people prior to the development of a product. For example, what are the main reasons people prefer to watch live content versus recorded live content? So if you were to set this up in a survey, you could have a question like, please indicate which of the following programs you like to watch live, and then you can have tick boxes, and then you could say something like, from your experience watching pre-recorded live content, which of the following can you identify as a reason why you like to watch live versus pre-recorded? So basically collecting a lot of information with just one or two questions will definitely help a design or product team understand how to design the next stage of their product. Or product teams may need at-scale feedback to decide between the design of two versions after running a series of lab studies. So for example, do users prefer to have a light or a dark background for their app? So it's like a one or two item question, but because in a usability study you have only 5 to 7 people, the response of 7 people is generally not enough to make some sort of a decision for designers to understand if more people like light or dark design. Again, this is like an arbitrary theoretical question, and you're probably thinking to yourself, well, it's better to make it customizable because some people like to watch videos on a light background and some people like to interact with websites on a dark background, but it should definitely be up to the user. And if you're thinking that way, then you're thinking absolutely correctly, but that's something that would have come out from a lab study. And then after interpreting the feedback from a lab study where people would actually explain, oh, well, in the daytime, I feel like the background should be light, but in the nighttime, I feel like the background should be dark. Based on feedback like that, then the design team can then eliminate like the green and blue backgrounds, for example, and then be only left with a light and dark background, and then at scale be able to survey a much larger population and get their response. So if we think about the purpose of surveys or survey research, it's basically the usage of questionnaires and interviews to ask people to provide information about themselves. Now, this information can pertain to attitudes or beliefs. We definitely use it to collect information on demographics as far as age, gender, marital status, etc. And it also helps us collect information on people's behaviors. So if you think of some examples of surveys, definitely the census that recently came out, that's a great example of a demographic survey. Another example of a survey that we commonly see in an academic setting is those ratings that you have, or the evaluation, your professor-teacher evaluations. That's another great example of a survey. All of those quizzes that you see on social media, those are also surveys because they're using your beliefs and your behaviors and your opinions to sort of figure out, like which movie character best represents you, which song best represents your life, so on and so forth. So anything in which you're providing feedback about yourself and your opinions and your thoughts, that's a great example of a survey. So as far as UX research, it definitely helps researchers study relationships among a variety of variables. So the common assumption here is that people are willing to provide truthful and accurate answers about themselves. Now, a response set is the tendency to respond to all questions from one particular perspective. And that's definitely something to be aware of when using a survey as your method of research. Social desirability is another, red flag kind of to be aware of. Basically, the idea behind social desirability is that people will tend to respond in a way that will make them look socially more desirable. And this causes people to sometimes lie or fake good responses. Whether or not the researcher is present or absent, people still feel inclined to misinform or even kind of fudge their responses a bit in order to look more acceptable and socially desirable. Some people also tend to underreport undesirable behaviors. So that would mean that, let's say it's a weight loss questionnaire, and the question is, how many calories do you eat per day? Sometimes people will feel shy or embarrassed to actually report the true number of calories that they eat and take in on a daily basis, and they might report a smaller number. This doesn't mean, however, that we should suspect that everyone is being untruthful or everyone is lying on these surveys. These are just things to be aware of. So while surveys are wonderful in collecting large amounts of very indescriptive data, we still have to be considerate and aware of the fact that sometimes people don't see things from a different perspective. Sometimes people are very likely to take on one perspective and just answer all of the questions in that way. Sometimes people tend to lie about their responses in order to look more acceptable in society. And basically, we also tend to underreport things that maybe we ourselves are not comfortable with. So, keeping that in mind, how should we construct a survey? Well, the most important thing in constructing a survey is to make sure you have very clear research objectives. What specifically do you want to know? It's very, very easy to go off topic when creating a survey. It's very easy to go off topic when you're talking to somebody live as well in a qualitative interview. But since our topic today is surveys, if you think about it, researchers are generally very, very curious people. And as you realize that you're conducting more and more of your own research, you start to become more and more curious. So it's like, well, if I have the participants' attention at this time, maybe I could add in a couple more questions. So you definitely don't want to do that. You want to make sure that your survey is very specific and it stays on one particular topic. If you're talking about people's attitudes and beliefs, you're generally interested in evaluating how people think about issues. If you're collecting information on facts and demographics, then you typically want to collect information on their gender, age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, employment, medical history, so on and so forth. It really depends on how much of this information is going to be helpful for you in creating the results of your study. I will say, however, that no matter what study you are conducting, no matter what the product team's question is, it's always a good idea to collect demographics prior to the beginning of the actual product-related questions, because in order for you to have external validity and basically generalizability, you kind of need to know a little bit about the population that is taking your survey. So asking things like age, gender, anything that you think might affect or show differences in the use of the product is definitely good information to have. And then, of course, we have behaviors. Is your survey focusing on past behaviors, on future behaviors, on present behaviors? So definitely think about what the research objectives are. Question wording is another really, really important factor. You want to make sure that you're using the most appropriate wording when you're creating your survey. So it's very easy for us researchers or anybody who works in the tech industry to use technological jargon or slang or acronyms or basically words that make sense to us when we're in the field and we're in a particular industry. But we have to make sure that we don't use any of those terms in any sort of survey that's going to be going towards participants. So you definitely don't want to use any unfamiliar technical terms. You also don't want to use any vague or imprecise terms. Try not to use words that can have more than one meaning. And if they can have more than one meaning and you have to use that word, then you want to make sure that you operationally define what that word means. So, for example, if you're asking a participant in a survey, if you're trying to ask them to explain why they were confused about the use of a particular product, you want to make sure that you can understand how to code that confusion. You want to make sure that you can that the participant understands what the word confused means. So if for example, I mean, generally people do understand what the word confused means, but if you think about it, another way that you could explain confusion is on a scale of 1 to 5, for example, how many times did the product do something that you were not expecting it to do? For example, if you actually clearly explain what behavior you're looking for, it will definitely make your survey better and stronger. Please make sure that you do not use ungrammatical sentence structure. You want to make sure that everything is readable, is comprehensible. So you want to make sure that you have a subject and a predicate in each question. And you also don't want to have phrasing that overloads working memory. So if we briefly talk about memory, we know that we have 3 different types of memory, right? We have sensory memory, we have short-term, aka working memory, and then we have long-term memory. Generally, short-term and or working memory lasts from 15 to 30 seconds. If you have a question that has a a lot of words, and if the question is very, very long, that is going to overload the participant's working memory to the point that by the time they get to the end of the question, they would have forgotten what the question even started with. So make sure that the wording is simple and that your questions are short. Do not embed the question with misleading information. Do not start a question by saying something like, well, we know that everybody understands how to use a MacBook Pro, but et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You definitely don't want to prime participants. You don't want to mislead them with facts. So try not to include any extra information beyond the question. So in order to avoid these issues, we consider the following things. So here are some factors specifically that help you avoid the things we saw on the previous slide. So stick to simplicity. Language should be easily understandable, no use of jargon or extremely technical terms. Provide a brief explanation for the definition of terms if you are in fact forced to use them. Double-barreled questions, another thing to watch out for. Avoid asking 2 things at once. Instead, try to use 2 questions. So an example of this should be, should senior citizens be given more money for recreation centers and food assistance programs? This is a double-barreled question because in this case, you're asking your participants to judge whether senior citizens should be given more money for recreation centers and more money for food assistance programs. These are 2 very unrelated things, so if a participant feels like they should be given more money for food assistance but not more money for recreation, or vice versa, that participant would not know how to answer this question because it is double-barreled. A loaded question is something to be aware of as well. Loaded questions lead people to respond in a certain way. So you don't want to use any emotionally charged words because that is going to introduce bias. So keep your wording neutral and keep it behavior-based. Try to eliminate any sort of emotions, opinions, and feelings. Try to keep it more scientifically objective versus subjective. Do not use negative wording. So avoid phrasing questions with negatives. So this is something like, how often have you not blah, 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 blah. So instead of saying how often have you not, it's better to say how often have you so on and so forth. Or, do you feel the city should not approve women's shelters? Right? So having that negative wording in there can throw the participant off and be confused by what the question is saying. And lastly, you want to stay away from yay saying or nay saying, which is basically avoid questions that can only allow participants to agree or disagree, or kind of have yes or no questions, because sometimes when people see only two options, agree, disagree, yes or no, they sometimes don't read the question in its entirety. So try to avoid things that are so black and white, so scales would be a good way to go about that. Maybe have a maybe option in there. So after you've constructed a survey, right, you've administered it, how do we actually analyze the responses? Well, the first thing to consider is that not all surveys have to be, or not all items in a survey have to be multiple choice or some sort of a scale. The ones that are, we call closed-ended, in which case the participants have a limited number of response alternatives that are given to them. These, of course, are more structured, easier to code, and much faster to get a response from people, meaning that participants are more likely to tick some boxes versus actually write you a lengthy explanation in response to a question. Open-ended questions, however, are good in the sense that people are able to express themselves more and they can answer the question in whatever way they like. So this often does provide some sort of insight into how people are thinking about this. So it gives us a little bit of the why in response to the question, but ultimately we are collecting the information about the what. So this is typically not used, open-ended questions are typically not used if variables are not well defined. So you want to make sure that you define your variables clearly in order for people to be able to provide their opinion on something. Rating scales are extremely popular when we talk about survey creation. And it's basically used to measure judgments of how much of something. This is great because you can obtain information on the evaluation of a product, the frequency of activity with it, how potentially people are able to understand how it works, how likely are people to recommend it to their friends, etc. A dichotomy for rating scales is often sufficient, like a yes or no, agree or disagree. But again, the less questions like this that you have, the better, and the less likely you will have skewed results. Typically, rating scales have 5 or 7 anchors, and they're labeled from one extreme to another. So why do we use 5 or 7 instead of 4 or 6? Well, generally 5 is a good number because you can have a true middle, a true neutral point. If you use an even number of anchors, then that middle point doesn't really exist, and so it will always be outweighed by the positive or the negative. So that's why we generally use 5 or 7. So when participants are answering your surveys, if we think a little bit about administering surveys to people perhaps in other countries or in other languages, or sometimes it's hard to just articulate using words a particular response, so using images such as the one we see at the bottom right of the screen, or sort of emojis, is another great way to kind of collect responses. So when you are finalizing your survey, you want to make sure that it looks professional. You want to make sure that you don't have any spelling or grammar errors. Imagine if you were administering your survey to a group of participants and they see, grammar mistakes or spelling mistakes within your survey. It's not really going to motivate them or encourage them to take you seriously in completing this survey. Participants should be able to locate response alternatives, so they don't need to go on like a wild goose chase in order to understand which anchors and which answer choices correspond to which question. So you want to have the question and the answer choices directly below it. If people are writing in their response, you want to make sure that you leave enough space between each question. Also, you don't want to use too small font and smash the different questions together. Again, everything should be legible and comfortable for participants to respond. You want to stay consistent with rating scales. So what that means, if in questions 1 through 5 you had extremely disagree to extremely agree, you want to make sure you keep that order instead of in question 6 suddenly flipping it where 1 is extremely agree, and then 5 is extremely disagree. So that's what we mean by staying consistent. You also want to consider the sequence in which the questions are going to be asked. So besides the fact that you shouldn't have a million item questionnaire, you want to have, generally anywhere between 7 to 10 questions is kind of acceptable. Of course, if you're paying participants much more and it's something really lengthy, then by all means you might have more questions. But for something basic that could appear while people are like reading an article from the New York Times, or maybe when they're watching a YouTube video, you have to understand that you don't have the attention span of the participants for that long of a time. You want to encourage them to actually answer the questions of the survey instead of click, skip, or ignore. So you want to make sure that you think about which questions are most important to you, and make sure that you show those first, because people can get tired, people can get bored, and then just drop off the survey. So if they answer some instead of none, or some instead of all of them, at least you'll have the data for the ones that are most important to you. And generally, it's a good idea to group the questions related to the same topic. If we think about the way information is actually stored in our minds, we store information in categories, and we're also able to retrieve information more quickly if that information is coming from the same category. So if you're going to ask a variety of questions about a product, you generally might group them by task. You don't want to jump all over the place and ask them how they felt about the ease of use for task 1, and then ask them about how likely they are to recommend this product to someone else in question 2, and then jump back to task 1 in question 3. Generally group your questions as they're related to each topic. And so now let's talk a little bit about how we administer surveys. So basically we talked about what a survey does. We talked about the best practices for writing your own survey. We talked about the types of research questions a survey can answer. And so now if we think about how do we actually get participants for our surveys? Well, there are 2 main ways that we talk about administering surveys in the field of UX research. There are printed or online questionnaires, or we can do them in person like an interview. So the questionnaires are typically less costly. They don't involve the researcher, and allows the participants to stay anonymous, generally in the comfort of their own home or wherever they are. Nowadays, we see a lot of surveys on mobile devices. It does require reading comprehension on the part of the participant. So again, that's something that we can't control because we are not there. It's something that we're hoping for the best and assuming that they are able to comprehend what the questions are, and that they're answering the question based on their comprehension. However, questionnaires on your own may get boring or demotivating. Of course, they may lead to this whole social desirability thing. They may lead to drop-off. But we generally have stopped mailing surveys because there is an extremely low response rate for mailed surveys. And that makes sense because so many things are now driven by technology. We have emailed surveys, we have SurveyMonkey, we have a variety of different websites that host surveys. We have social media surveys. So these digital surveys basically get us answers much more quickly. So there's a very, very low response rate for mailed surveys. Online surveys are definitely increasingly popular. The downside to these type of survey administration is that the participants can't ask questions if they need clarification on something that they saw in the survey. And again, we can't control for ineligible or false information. So surveys are great, but just remember, always be aware that not absolutely everything that was written or all of the results were actually true. If we talk about interviews, the response rates tend to be higher. So again, we're not talking about cognitive interviews. By interview, we mean if you stop someone and say, hey, do you have a couple minutes to answer some questions that I have? And then you might hand them a piece of paper, or you might just orally read them the question and then jot down their response. So you can imagine that the response rate for this might be higher because people are less likely to walk away from you if you speak to them. And they're also less likely to leave questions unanswered because they kind of feel responsible that someone is actually standing there asking them. Whereas if you're on paper, whereas if you're at home completing a survey on paper or online, you're much more you feel less guilty if you just skip a question or ignore it. However, there is this element of interviewer bias when an interview is conducted by a researcher in person. So if we talk about interviewer bias, this typically gets introduced in some sort of face-to-face interview. So the interviewer and respondent meet to conduct the interview. Of course, this is used for a smaller sample size because we would definitely have less time to meet face to face with people than if we just email blasted everybody a survey. A telephone interview is less expensive than a face-to-face interview. It does allow us to get data collected quickly, but it is very common for people to hang up the phone. There are computer-assisted telephone interviews where questions are prompted on a screen and then data is entered directly into a computer for analysis. So those kind of eliminate the bias because the person is not actually speaking to them. But this computerized telephone system, of course, does lead to people hanging up on you or hanging up on the system and not providing their data. So if we talk about where we get these participants and kind of what kind of samples go into this, we should think about probability sampling, which means that each member of a population has a specifiable probability of being chosen. So yes, we do have random sampling at times, but again, this is very different in the field of human factor psychology because we typically, when we test products, we want to make sure that we're testing them on the audience who is likely to use them. So we might use something like stratified random sampling. In stratified random sampling, you will conduct a random sample after you've identified the people who match a particular criteria. So non-probability sampling says that the probability of any member of the population to be chosen is actually unknown. So we might use something like convenience sampling. With convenience sampling, you select participants in any way that's convenient to the researcher, which of course is likely to introduce bias. So for example, if you are evaluating the new self-checkout system at stores, and you only go to your local store at only one particular hour of the day, let's say it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon when a bunch of parents or moms, let's say, are doing their final shopping prior to picking up their kids from school, then you're going to have a very, very biased sample of these like moms that are going to pick up their kids from school, and especially geographically if you only visit one store that has that self-checkout. So even though there are certain techniques that help us sample people that are in fact true users of a product, we still need to make sure that we're not introducing any bias. And in order to generalize our results, we need to kind of expand that sample a bit. Purposive sampling means that participants must meet a certain criteria. So again, if you're testing medical equipment that's common for arthritis, let's say, for populations of people that suffer from arthritis, you're probably not going to recruit 18-year-old students to test this device because they're not the likely population who will be purchasing the device or using it. On the other hand, you could argue that a lot of the elderly population will depend on their children or grandchildren for help with this device. Therefore, it would be a good reason to test them. So it really depends on what the researcher's study criteria are. So purposive sampling is definitely another type of sampling that we use. Quota sampling is the same as stratified sampling, but it doesn't use random sampling after they've been identified according to that strata. So it uses convenience sampling instead. So if you think back to stratified random sampling, that means you're going to identify participants who match a certain criteria. For example, if I am testing a new interface for the gaming section of YouTube, I will probably want to identify people who watch gaming videos on YouTube, and then from that group of people, I will randomly select who will participate in the study. So that is still stratified random sampling. Quota sampling would be different. Quota sampling would be something like, I'm interested in testing a new layout for YouTube gaming. I am going to create a strata. I'm going to select participants who match the criteria of watching gaming content on YouTube. And then I'm just going to ask a bunch of my friends who match that criteria because that's convenient for me. So I'm not going to actually randomly select people. I'm going to select people that I know that personally watch gaming videos on YouTube. Maybe they're really good gamers. Maybe they are even the gaming creators themselves. So that would be using a convenience sample instead of a random sample after I've identified that they match a certain criteria. So generally, that's the least desirable. We don't generally want to do convenience sampling because, again, it does introduce. So if we think about all of the things that we've learned today about surveys, at the beginning, we talked about the difference between quantitative and qualitative methodology. We discussed that even in a qualitative research setting, a survey is one of the most popular quantitative methods that we use in UX research. We talked about the goals of surveys and the types of questions that they aim to answer. We understand that we're collecting small bits of information from very large groups of people when we use surveys. We understand that surveys are generally targeted toward understanding the what about people's behavior as opposed to the why between the people's behavior. We talked about the various factors that go into constructing a survey and the best practices, the things that we should do and the things that we should avoid. We talked about analyzing responses. We talked about coding. We talked about using emojis for responses. We talked about using scales. We talked about open-ended versus closed-ended questions. And we also discussed how the most common way that we administer surveys these days is electronically online or using these brief interviews. Again, mailed surveys are not very popular anymore, and neither are the recorded telephone messages. And then we wrapped up our discussion by talking about the different methods of sampling that we use when we try to recruit participants for our surveys. So hopefully you found this informative. Just as my own 2 cents about working as a UX researcher in industry, even though I am trained in statistics, even though I have a strong quantitative background, in my job as a qualitative researcher, a lot of my skills do depend on interviewing ability, understanding patterns of behavior, things like that. But understanding how to construct a survey, how to construct a good survey, and how to interpret the results and present them to stakeholders and product teams is definitely a skill that you want to have even as a qualitative researcher. So again, I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions, please drop some comments below or send me an email at csundancingprofessor@gmail.com. Thanks so much, and I'll see you on the next episode.